Well, Paul, super excited to have you here today for a discussion on a topic that I've heard a lot more folks talking about and starting to implement, especially over the course of the last year, which is medical omnichannel, obviously, especially with the rise of things like social media, right, and more digital presence that HCPs have, et cetera. So looking forward to digging into this with you. With that, I would love for you to maybe talk a little bit about your background and all of the work that you've done on the Sci Comms and omnichannel side.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Vera. So I'm Paul O'Grady. Till recently was the head of scientific communications in oncology at GSK. Right now I'm between gigs, but I've also been doing this for a number of years. So done scientific communication at a number of companies, and prior to the GSK role, I was the medical multi-channel at the time lead at Novartis Oncology for 3 years. So I definitely have seen this space evolve in the last 5 to 8 years. I was definitely one early in doing digital in medical at Novartis at the time, and it's really great to see so much interest and so much industry effort in this because we all consume digital media, we all have phones, are using digital to communicate, and it is a tool we should be using. And it's not necessarily the tool we have to use above all else, but it is a tool we should be using. So how do we put our heads together around that, and how do we actually apply a strategy to that is really where we're all coming to.
Thank you for sharing that background and context. So, I know that you've seen kind of the early days of, let's say, medical omnichannel back 5 to 8 years ago. And I'm curious with that, how have you seen the concept or the conversation or the execution around medical omnichannel change over, the last 5 to 8 years, and kind of where are we today when it comes to medical omnichannel?
Yeah, it's definitely an evolution. I'm a medical psychom guy who moved kind of into this early, and I think there's also other great people, like people with your more background or tech experience, coming to the table. And it's how do we actually all speak the same language, because we haven't, right? And that's also a key part of this. Medical hadn't always spoken this language, right? I remember years ago trying to explain about multi-channel and omnichannel at the time, and I used to do this joke, which would be you have 5 medical affairs leaders in a room, and you ask them to define multi-channel and omnichannel, and you'll get 8 answers, right? We started using this language quickly, and I definitely have had colleagues going, I don't understand this, when the reality is it's about a resetting and understanding these principles coming from technology and from retail, but not doing things inappropriately. Medical's been doing channel work for a number of years, and we need to start applying principles so we can work out how to do it. And really, that's all it's about. It's about putting the thinking down and getting everybody on the same page and doing the right thinking and the right work.
So how would you define omnichannel? So if I ask you that question with respect to medical, or even today, if you walk into a conference room of 5 medical affairs professionals, what answer do you think they would give?
I think these days it's been really nice to see the growth in digital understanding in medical over the number of years. So, I was talking there about quite a few years ago, and now I think most people really have a good understanding of what omnichannel is. Maybe not the nuances, but at least more comfortable with the language. I like to talk about it as an omnichannel journey, right? Because omnichannel is a place you're trying to get to, but everything is changing, right? Tech is changing constantly on us, right? So what you set up today is going to shift, and appetites will shift on how people are consuming content with different technology. So it's always going to be something that's evolving, something you're going to try to get to, but it's always going to shift and you're never going to quite get there. So I think you need to really understand the different main camps. Of course, we have the different multiple parts of omnichannel. We're taking the idea of, can you have the right relationship and the right distribution, you put in my medcom hat on, of the right content to the right person at the right time, but are you doing it in the right channel? And that can be with the MSL, customizing and really having an engagement with their doctor. And MedInfo really doing their great job with medical letters and unsolicited requests, and the broader things like medical education. With all of this stuff, how do we approach our channels? How do we have an increased understanding of our customers? And how do we apply this? Does that make sense? Or have I gone a bit too adrift there?
Yeah, and kind of what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that ultimately, I think in part historically, there might have been some confusion of interpretations of omnichannel in the perspective of multi-channel. So it's we have these new channels, so therefore let us, copy and paste content and been reformatted, but it's the same content to a new channel, versus the omni-channel experience in one way is also, to your point about understanding your customer and their journey with your knowledge, which could mean that you might have multiple touch points across multiple channels, and that can create kind of a cohesive end journey, for that stakeholder. So I think that's one component of what I heard you say. And then the second component from what I heard you kind of talk about is in reference is that medical affairs has, in a way, always had an omni-channel approach in that historically, right, they had
Yeah.
field medical and med info, and those are two channels, and publications and med comms and medical education, etc. So those are all channels that a doctor or other stakeholders can engage with. So rather than also looking at omni-channel as this kind of new thing that all of a sudden popped up 5 years ago, well, it really, in a way, isn't. It's always kind of existed. It's just the terminology and perhaps omni-channel as a framework has now come more to the surface.
Yeah, and I'd agree with all of that. A few things to just elaborate on, right? So we have multi-channel and omni-channel. And I think also part of the sensitivity and confusion is like you just said, we have MSL, MedInfo, publication as a channel. The reality is that those are also departments where people have worked for a number of years. And if you've been doing that job for like 15 years, do you want to be told you're now a channel, right? So there's sensitivities there in around how we're talking about this language. We also very quickly started having omni-channel departments, but when omni-channel wasn't defined, so when you're working in a big corporation, it can get confusing as to what is the department definition versus what is the actual, in theory, academic principle that we're trying to aspire to. I think the key thing here is you have these established groups in medical affairs, and they're all fantastic, and they've all been around for a while because they are needed. You also asked about how does omnichannel work and how does it sit, right? So the idea being that if you're going to have a coordinated approach, can it be the same experience from that booth at a congress to that medical letter to that HCP stuff? And obviously with that, there's a whole amount of medcom, psycom content that comes with that. So the reality is to get to medical omnichannel, the key part is for medical affairs is it's actually more about making sure we're not silos, making sure your team is in sync, and that in sync is in pubs with medical info, medical affairs strategy, MSL, medcom, all working together and knowing who is doing what and how is doing what and how is that coordination. And that's where often many companies now have medical excellence and other digital transformation team members now coming in. So it's about how do we partner, how do we work together. We also need tight coordination, home office and field, because at the end of the day, an MSL is the best person to have a detailed discussion with their doctor using whatever are the approved materials. And their ability to do that and be effective is only as good as if they're using the materials in the right way, right? And so that coordination, if you're truly trying to do omnichannel, it's about doing things tighter. Similarly, like a medcom team, like one I just left, can be generating the best materials for the company to use. But if then the countries are not then taking those materials and using them in the right manner and doing their pull through, then you're also, again, not going to get to any sort of medical omnichannel effect. Really, we're in an era now where we've got to make sure it's kind of funny in a way. We've got to embrace this technology, this new way of talking. So, I mean, a key part here then is obviously MSL to home office or country to global if you're one of the larger companies. The irony here is that to get to medical omnichannel, it's about how do we coordinate, how do we collaborate. And yes, we're embracing technology and new language and new ways of working, but really the key to success is tighter ways of working.
And what I'm hearing from really what you're saying in terms of embracing medical omnichannel within the team is it's really almost this framework of collaboration and cohesion that permeates across all of your departments. It's not necessarily this one tool that you use and then all of a sudden like you have omnichannel. A lot of it is kind of coordinating this journey across the multiple touch points, i.e. teams, publications, field medical, med info, med comms that are really executing their respective, channels, so to speak, and collaborating together to ensure a cohesive experience that fits within your medical, strategy.
Exactly. Because, I mean, the other thing I would also say is also don't be afraid of, yes, ideally you want to aspire to a principle of what is omnichannel going to be. But there are some things things that are already established, right? And that those are working well. The other thing to remember is some things can't be optimized. The example I will give is medical education. When you work, especially in the US, we have all the ACCME and independent medical education. It's a very, very well thought out process, but it's also independent, right? So companies will give out sponsorship grants to independent people who will generate medical education. Well, because that is done as a grant, because it can't be optimized, it can't be a feedback loop. So some of your channels can get to omnichannel, where they in theory will be in sync and talk to each other, and some channels can be multi-channel and just help you in your amplifying your data dissemination to hopefully people understand the evolution of the disease state, the evolution of treatment, and lead to better educated doctors. But if it's not optimized because it can't be and shouldn't be, that's okay, and we need to be all right with that.
That touches also on this element of how to translate this concept of omnichannel from more of like that commercial lens that has existed around for a while to what it actually means in the medical affairs context, right? And some of that is not one to one. And to your point around optimizing, right? Like there's certain channels, on commercial, even outside of the industry, like talk about retail, stores that sell products. Like they're not going to have medical education type of courses, right? So that's kind of a unique concept to medical affairs. And when we're thinking the omni-channel approach in medical affairs, not everything is going to literally translate one to one from like a traditional marketing omni-channel definition. And I think this is a good example of how to think about it in context of medical affairs.
But it works both ways, and I'm glad you mentioned retail and commercial, right? One other thing, like when we were talking about how things changed, and I forgot to mention, key thing is I think many companies are starting to look at, in medical, the principle of HCP segmentation. When you look at like different attitudes, we all consume data differently, and there can be preferences in how you want to consume information, what channel, or how do you want an email, do you want a newsletter, do you want a video, right? So what type of content do you want to consume? But similarly, even within a disease, there can be, well, I believe in this, or I believe in this, or I'm skeptical about this. And so understanding those patterns of behavior to science also is something I think some companies are really starting to look at in medical, which is appropriate. If it's helping you understand a doctor and disseminate to a doctor and do a better, more effective job to meet that medical affairs goal, then it's fine. The intent is non-promotional, but it's about 8, 9, 10 years ago, I remember being approached about segmentation, and the attitude, quite rightly then, was, no, that is a commercial. So it's really a case of, you should look at retail, you should look at commercial, and look at what they've done and how they do it. But the opposite is not also true. I've certainly had, commercial stakeholders come to me going, you need to do it this way. No, we don't. We've got set ways of working. So it has to be, medical affairs needs to understand this well and take the good stuff that does apply to medical affairs. But when it's inappropriate or when you really shouldn't do it, you say no. But embrace the good stuff and leave the rest on the floor, and that way you can evolve.
And with your example around HCP segmentation, I know on the MSL and field medical side, back in the day, there used to be a specific role that tried to understand how best doctors learn, right? I mean, even generally, people can learn visually, right? Or people can learn through listening or through writing. So I think in a similar manner, understanding with HCP segmentation, certain doctors, don't fully understand this new mechanism of action, right? And that's kind of part of their profile. Well, that's important to understand to be able to educate appropriately, which is a function of medical affairs, educate on the science, right? So segmentation, that concept, even though it was commercial or traditionally came from the commercial lens, how can you translate that into medical affairs?
Exactly.
Really educate.
Exactly. And that's why it's about what is the segmentation that applies to medical. It's not, we should just take a commercial segmentation, right? And then there's nuances to that which probably are going to be different by company to company. And obviously I can't go into greater detail. But if you, again, so take the right principle, and if it helps you do your job more effectively, right, get you to a better educated doctor, then it's good. If there's another purpose, no, don't do it.
That makes sense. Well, I'm happy to hear about the evolution and kind of translation of omnichannel into a more medical setting, because even I had the sense, I would say early last year, where there, and I'm sure there still continues to be to this day to a certain extent, this kind of sensitivity of the concept of omnichannel coming from commercial. So therefore, is promotional and like, oh no, a big no, when in reality, can we take those principles that you're referring to, right, and translate those principles into the medical context in a way that helps with education, ultimately medical strategy. So with that, that's a good segue into if you are a medical affairs team and you're looking to kickstart your medical omnichannel strategy, if you might not have had a framework for one before, how would you think about approaching that as a team?
You look at your ways of working, look at your building blocks, right? Obviously, it's going to be very much driven around things like key data releases and launches, but there's also other medical touch points like guidelines, etc., or clinical trials where you can embrace digital touch points as part of your interactions with your doctors and therefore set up an omnichannel journey. The reality is, however, is like really look at the principles of what do you need to do to get to the best medical affairs job, right? And so obviously those principles are not changing. You still need MSLs. You still need MedInfo. You still need publications, as we've discussed. And so look at those, but then it's really then, okay, amongst your team, what are your building blocks, right? So it's going to be an iterative journey. One thing I've said to people when I've done some talks on this is I talk about it as an omnichannel journey, just like we said earlier. You're not going to get to everything, and everyone can have a ton of ideas, right? There's tons of different ways you can do digital. Set your building blocks, set your basics first, and do those well. Get yourself to a foundation of what your core channels will be, and get them set up. Then you can start doing more iterative evolution stuff, but you need to pick, like, say, your first 3 channels first, get them set up, get them going well, and then do more. If you try and do every channel and every idea, you won't have the resources, you won't have the time, and you won't get any of them to any effectiveness. So you have to pick and choose.
And it sounds like, part of building that foundation out as the first step, there is, prioritizing the different channels. Are there other foundational building blocks that you need to consider, like platforms or processes that you need to evolve at the beginning?
I think you have like some key ones like your MSL, your MedInfo, response and repository is always going to be key, as is going to be your medical affairs portal, right? More and more so these days, although there's complexity with that, especially if you go global. That being said, fundamentals, what else do you need? From a home office perspective, you need your digital asset management repository. What is your repository of all your approved materials and with all the right balances as to permissions, etc., so you know what you have to work with. Similarly, to get to what is in there, you need to have a robust medical review process, medical, legal, and maybe other departments. What is your process and how do you do that? And of course, you're going to need the right training and change management for how to approach that within your organization. The other thing to think about is, as you're evolving, say your main building blocks are looking at things with MSL and medical portal and email, you need to really understand things around websites, privacy, and if you're going there, things like CRM.
Got it. So it's almost, if I had to summarize that, there is these perhaps like 3 buckets these foundational building blocks fall into. The first bucket being, are you using the right tech tooling and software to support your needs, from a digital asset management system to something like a promo mats or like a review tool or a CRM system. So that's one. The second bucket is really the right processes. So the medical review process or the right processes around websites and your compliance policies around that, change management, and as a team adapting to omnichannel. So that's kind of number 2. And number 3 is picking the right channels. So I think when we go into the topic of being able to pick the right channels, what are kind of the channels available to medical holistically? And I'm also curious to touch on some of the newer channels like social media or perhaps the use of email as well within that. So maybe step 1 is, what are the channels?
Totally happy to go into. So like we said, we've got MSL and how they work, MedInfo and how they work. You also have publications, with both your Congress activity and your long form publications, and your medical education, which could be your independent medical education, your IME, as we've noted before, or even things like satellite Symposia and other educational events. Live is still a channel, even if it may not be digital or on the day, it has digital components. You can do an invite digitally now, right, for that stuff. So how does that factor in? Similarly, like new channels that we're really, I think, heavily embracing missing is the medical HCP portal and the idea of email. Now, email we've always used, right? An MSL has email, a MedInfo person has emailed. So this is also where it gets complex. In some channels go across multiple departments or multiple other kind of like ways of working on channels, as you think about it. An MSL will answer a request from a doctor or maybe send it on to MedInfo for them to do a customized response to an undocumented request. So that way of working can be variable, depends on how that place works or how complex the question being asked are. The newer parts of this, though, are things like campaign email, right? So campaign is, a commercial, a marketing word. But that being said, you can look at that in newsletters and it's like, is there a medical way of doing this that is appropriate? For example, so like go back to what I was just talking about. You can have a distribution list which maybe is around your medical education events, doing an invite. You can have a way of doing the Home Office will come up with a kind of a standard template around making sure a doctor is aware of the latest data at a major congress. Now, it's up to the country and the MSL to work out if or no that should be used and can that be used. But then Home Office coming up with the template for then the country or the MSL to consider using, that's a new thing. So there are ways and means you can think about these use cases, but it has to be talked through and it has to be correct. And it also has to have the right appetite, because that doesn't mean you are doing an email with promotional intent, right? Coming back to, we can take the idea, but we're not commercial. If it's appropriate for the MSL to do that email by their local rules and regulations, by the needs of that doctor, then that can be talked through and maybe it's something your organization can consider. To start just trying to do mass emails as if we are commercial with an intent to spam content, that isn't going to fly. So it's finding the right use case and finding the right way of working to embrace this technology and get it out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and before digging into kind of the compliance and ways to think about what is this line between non-promotional communication versus what could potentially be, considered promotional when it comes from medical, one channel I'm curious to get your thoughts on is social, right? So whether it's things like LinkedIn, this rise of DOLs, how do you, with your expertise and experience, view those social channels in terms of what outcomes and value they can provide to medical?
I think it depends on what sort of therapy area you're working on as to where your approach to DOLs is coming in. So I've been heavily working in the oncology hematology space, which is still very focused on the top tier doctors because it's such a limited pool. I think if you're doing something in a primary care or going to every, say, primary care doctor in the world, digital touch points and DOLs can become very key into your plan, right? You need to be thinking through those about what are you doing with those DOLs, how are you doing it, what are the rules and regulations, and also how can you look at that work and how do you also make sure that you're not actually applying misinformation, right? So there is risk to that. I do think there are definitely some good pilots out there, but I don't think we're at a point yet where there's good standardization. The other thing is also medical social challenge. I've seen a lot of stop-start there over the years, and a lot of wish. I think some companies are getting there and others are still talking it through. You have to realize that while social channels are out there, medical is meant to be in talking to HCPs. So if you're putting something out there on, say, X or some other platform, that's going to the general population, which is a different way of working, a different set of guidelines. So looking at social media, looking at social listening, looking at analysis, looking at tactics, there's a lot of ways of working that need talking through within your organization and a lot of discussions, especially between medical and oftentimes your communications department, because, your main channels for the organization in the social channels are always going to be owned by them. So it's when should they lead and where is that space for medical? And that needs to be clearly discussed. I am seeing some companies doing some very good work, however, doing medical awareness of congresses, of data releases by medical through social channels. But I think we're not quite there yet. Going back to the earlier part of this conversation, not every company, I think, is fully comfortable with that from a risk perspective yet. It's going to take a little bit longer to get to a more standard way of working across the industry there.
So it sounds like because it's kind of in the earlier stages, the things to potentially consider if you're exploring these more social channels is, one, what is the goal that you're trying to achieve, right, with your communications or education? And is social does your audience live on there? What therapeutic area are you in, right? Because oncology might have certain types of stakeholders that are going to be different if you're in, cardiovascular or maybe diabetes or more primary
Exactly.
care type of therapeutic areas. And then two, I would say, is knowing how to collaborate internally to understand the risk appetite and current processes around communicating in those channels. So Moms owns the access to those social channels, collaborating with them, and then also having conversations with legal, privacy, and compliance to kind of understand where's the comfort level that they have around what should be communicated around those channels. And then kind of based off of that, determining within the medical strategy perspective, perhaps, where do those channels fit in? And it might also be the case that out of all of the channels you have at your disposal, like social might not be the top priority. So you're focusing on field med info, medical education, etc.
Exactly. So there's a lot of discussion here, and I think there is some effectiveness and a lot of nuance to it, but definitely it's not to the point where it is the number one priority for every asset and every brand.
Right. And this is then a good segue, I feel like, into the compliance piece. So I know still, and this is evolving and probably is so dependent on the company and the team, but a big part of transitioning into a medical omni-channel approach is, understanding and aligning internally on, compliance and what is defined as, quote, promotional when it comes from medical versus what is non-promotional, right? So I'm curious, like, how you look at that or how you would encourage teams to maybe a framework or what questions to ask to encourage that collaboration and discussion to ultimately determine that definition for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is more detailed and it is more complex, right? Got good medical ways of working and have had for many years, but it really is about how do you engage these stakeholders? How do you have a discussion around new ways of working and new understandings of different things? And I think it's also about making sure as medical affairs, we're actually thinking a bit broader, right? What could have been years ago, you just talked with a couple of medical people and maybe a legal occasionally, but now your legal touch point is more frequent. You also need to be engaging compliance. You may need to, they may want to pull in regulatory. If you're doing global digital work, you need to be understanding functions like privacy to really understand all their viewpoints. And, only from understanding the different viewpoints of the different stakeholders and from where they're coming from with all the different rules and regulations, can you really get to what good looks like. While there are getting more and more standards in different countries on certain things, there are also plenty of grey. So from that discussion, the individual team can then look at it, understand the different dimensions of what is going on, and from collaboration get to what the risk appetite for your group is going to be. So there's no one size fits all. I don't think on this podcast or any other sort of meeting or discussion you could have, can you get to a one shoe fits all answer here. It's about what's your discussion about what you're trying to do and also the risk appetite of your organization.
That makes sense. And kind of that's a common question that I've gotten in discussions with medical affairs teams. And the sense that I've also gotten is that there isn't necessarily an industry standard for how we think about that in the context of medical omnichannel. So to your point, it's something that has to be discussed at a company and team level and country level to get an understanding.
Exactly. But if I can also add on, like, think about the previous discussion, right? We said, like, pick your channels and do the first few well, and then you can do more. It definitely is. And also think about what I was saying about segmentation years ago was nothing, and now it's something people are exploring more heavily. The reality is that if you do a few things well, and then you set up that way of working with those stakeholders at the table and you're working together, then you'll get to a point where there will be comfort. And then when you have that next idea, then you would have more. And it doesn't mean you're going to start doing things you shouldn't, because no one is trying to. But as far as setting things up and having ongoing communication, ongoing discussion, the comfort level is going to grow if you can show you can do it correctly with one channel with the right level of appropriateness. So then when you go to have the next discussion, you have principles of which you can maybe use for the next set of guardrails, and you can go along together.
And part of why omnichannel is an iterative journey, so to speak, is so that way you can also start by breaking it down into smaller pieces. Start there, do it well, establish the right processes, which builds comfort level and gives more data points and certainty to then further expand the capabilities of medical omnichannel across the much more effectively.
Yep, exactly.
So, with that, let's say you're a team, right? You've engaged in having a medical omnichannel strategy, you've picked your channels, you have the solid foundational building blocks, you're probably running a couple of campaigns. So, how do we get to the point of being able to measure what the effectiveness of medical omnichannel is? And are we, or some folks might be earlier in their process than others? Is it almost too early to be able to establish ways of measuring effectiveness because it's too new?
Yeah, I've got this question a lot. I think you can establish KPIs and metrics within your organization, and there's many ways you can look at that, and you need long-standing team alignment for that, because the other thing is obviously you can't just be changing your metrics constantly, right? You need something to then use consistently over a period of time. And can you optimize your metrics per channel? Yeah, you probably should, right? That being said, there are sensitivities here. Historically, medical hasn't had a lot of metrics, and the volume of MSL visits or the length of an MSL visit is not necessarily, say, a metric of the quality of the visit or of the value of that relationship, right? So you do need to look at this stuff with sensitivity and like what can be collected and what should be collected should be an active part of the discussion. The other thing to think about, I do think it is premature on certain things. One thing that I get asked is, well, how do I, in theory, to make sure you have omnichannel, you should be optimizing, right? I don't think anybody at this point can say this many MSL visits equals that many MedInfo queries equals a third dimension in medical education touchpoints. We can't quantify and compare against the medical channels yet, and I'm not even sure we should, right? So, portal metrics, individual metrics around each one, they're totally valid, and if you can use those metrics and also other things you'll get back from your engagement, so your insights and other stuff that you'll be getting to impact your plan, that tells you the effectiveness of what you're doing. So it's not necessarily about generating numbers and micromanaging numbers, but it is really about what's the data you can get back overall and how can you do better informed decision making for your next iteration of your medical plan.
So there's almost, if I had to kind of summarize at a high level all of the great points that you've made. So I think one, there's a sense of, and I agree with, measuring medical omnichannel, whether it's just performance metrics all the way to is it actually driving impact in clinical practice, is just very complex, right? Because an omnichannel journey could be an HCP touching MedInfo and then having 2 interactions with field medical and then taking a CME course and then seeing your data at a congress. And I mean, that's just the true kind of omnichannel journey of one stakeholder, right? So I think tracking all of that is just, it's very difficult until omnichannel evolves to enable the ability to perhaps track that in an easier way. So that's kind of one. But then to your point of, well, what you can measure is, internally you can align on what metrics are meaningful to you as a team. So there could be those performance metrics, sure, number of MSL visits or number of websites. While that's important and good to track, really there's this other element of the more qualitative insights that you get from all of that. And how does that actually inform your medical strategy? Because there's value to that. Other kind of ways I've heard measuring proxies to impact is, surveys and things like that. Of course, similar to performance metrics or the qualitative insights, like they are not necessarily measurements of change in clinical practice, right? So they're not perfect measures of that. Only really claims and diagnostics in a compliant way could really be, in a way, a measure of that. Those are some of the buckets of ways that I've heard folks talk about in terms of trying to measure.
Yeah, it's all good.
All right. Well, with that, I'm curious, what do you think folks get wrong about medical omnichannel?
I think that it's easy, right? It takes more people and more discussion than I think people think initially at the outset. I think the other part is people say omnichannel as if omnichannel is just the things that a company is defining, whereas omnichannel is generally more than that, but a company is picking certain things to focus on, right? I mean, the other key thing, though, is while it is new, and it's going back to our opening discussion, I had colleagues going, can you explain what a channel is to me? And these people had years of experience. The reality is it's not new, right? And I think we need to give ourselves a pat on the back. Medical Affairs has always done medical strategy, publications, MedInfo, MSLs have have been the most effective way of communicating to our customers for years. These are all good ways of working, and they all are part of Omnichannel. So I think we need to really just embrace that. This is a new way of talking. This is a new way of discussing and a framework. But I think in the discussion, you can get lost in the hype, and we aren't giving ourselves credit in that we've done a lot of this work and have been doing it for decades. And the reality is that we don't need to throw it all out the window to do Omnichannel. We need to embrace what we've been doing well and maintain it and just embrace this new language a bit better.
It's like a lot of it sounds like is taking the frameworks that have been historically implemented and working, but embracing these kind of, whether it's new technologies or new channels or new ways to engage, to educate into that framework. And that effectively is omnichannel. It's just we kind of gave it a new word. Like maybe it wasn't called omnichannel before, but just because there's a new word for it doesn't mean it's completely this new concept. You have to work
and it
everywhere.
does mean what you were doing in your SOPs and the ways of working have to change yesterday.
Right. And piggybacking off of that, I'm curious as well, what are the key lessons that you've learned about implementing medical omnichannel? And if you had to start a new medical omnichannel strategy from the ground up today, how might you approach it differently?
I think we're going back to what we talked about earlier, like picking your good building blocks and building those and blowing them out is a key thing. I think, especially when I was first starting like 8 years ago, the big trend at the time was, well, the big bets, like everyone should be doing an app. And there's great digital ideas out there beyond the building blocks. Don't get me wrong, there's really good ideas out there. But those, like doing an app, you could spend a large amount of money on an app, take you 2 years, and then people don't want to use it when it's launched. So it has to be doing the right thing in the right way that you're going to get uptake. And a lot of these are early ways of working were doing something new. It was going to be the right thing to do and going to be a game changer, but it wasn't the right idea. So you have to pick and choose your priorities. The other thing then is we all use technology differently, right? So we all use technology constantly. So whenever you do any channel, or even when I say I was doing the app, you show it to people go, well, why doesn't it do this? Or can we do this? Or can you do that? So in dealing with people, the ideas that come back at you doing digital omnichannel work are this much, but you can only do this much, right? So you have to pick your priorities, but then also do the feedback loop, do an iterative, and embrace people. You have to sell what you do, and you have to get people to embrace what you have initially for now, but take what you have on board and sell and take their input and do it better for later. So as in, if you do the feedback loop, you can take those 5 ideas and maybe the next 2 can be what comes out in a year. And I think we're now getting to the point where people are starting looking at that type of process within companies, within departments, whereas before it was just who's shouting loudest, and that's not always the way to do it.
So it's almost like, if I to summarize that, it's one, establishing your foundational building blocks, and whether it's a DAM, a digital asset management, the right medical review process, et cetera, that's really critical to just enable you to move quickly. 2 is prioritize correctly, because, to your earlier point, medical omnichannel is not this easy thing. It's going to require resources and effort.
Exactly.
And the more you put on your plate, the less you'll be able to really execute well across everything, right? If you're stretched thin. So prioritize well. And for those channels or strategies within omnichannel you are prioritizing, have the iterative feedback loop that is more data driven, so to speak, instead of perhaps being more driven by the loudest voice in the room.
Exactly.
That makes sense. And of course, the last question I have to ask you, with all of the hype around AI and Gen AI, is, do you feel like tools like AI can help with medical omnichannel? Or, is medical omnichannel perhaps a little bit too early in its evolution to be able to fully take advantage of what AI or tech has to offer?
I mean, I think AI is here, right? It's embedded in our tech that we're getting for our personal use. And then we also have things like what you're looking at, so like, how can we mine insight, stuff like that. But when you look at like medcom work and Gen AI is kind of here. So is it here yet? I don't know. Probably on a cusp. I think there are definitely things that people can start playing with. ISMAP, for example, ISMAP are the publication planning work industry nonprofit, just for anybody who doesn't know. They are starting a Gen AI working group. So the medcom agencies and companies really looking at that. It's going to take time, right? I think the medcom companies are definitely looking at it. Pharma should be looking at it with both procurement and tech partners to see what you want and whether that's internal or external. And it may be there are new services out there that people need to embrace. That being said, there's risk. I can't be relying on Gen AI, and when you have something that can create hallucination or or a factual inaccuracy, and have some auto generation of content that then puts something out in the world which is like of wrong information to a doctor on how a drug works or what the data says, that can lead to significant fines and reputational risk. So I think there is a lot to look at here, and it's a little early, but it's definitely coming. So you've got to pay attention.
And to your point, I think the reality from a market trend perspective within life sciences and pharma and medical affairs is that Gen AI is here. It is here to stay. So it's at a minimum important to at least keep track of what is happening, whether it's FDA guidances on AI, all the way to what projects, what are MedCom agencies doing, or what projects are other companies working on that they might share a little bit publicly about when it comes to Gen AI, and understanding the technology, because it is here to stay. It might be a little early in its development from like a MedCom's perspective to understand what are those true use cases where it's going to provide immediate ROI. If I had to take like a tech lens on it, I think there's probably kind of 2 to 3 buckets where AI can play in different ways. So there's the one that you talked about, which is MedComs or content generation. I would say that that is still early. Folks are really exploring that. It's a very obvious use case for Gen AI, but the considerations there are oftentimes because of things like hallucinations, right? Or potential factual inaccuracies. Also being in a very regulated industry, it's important to have guardrails. So I think a lot of folks that are experimenting with it internally tend to experiment in, first drafts or kind of lower risk scenarios, or have the right guardrails in place, right? So have a human review everything. So that's kind of one bucket. The second bucket, I would say, to your point, is on the HCP segmentation side. And this kind of starts to tie into insights. So understanding educational preferences of HCPs. So AI models, not necessarily Gen AI, but AI models in general can help with that. I would say that's a bit more advanced. I'm sure commercial probably on their end is using segmentation with AI baked in, but I could see medical eventually from an educational perspective potentially evolving into that. And then the last bucket is really those qualitative insights. So can you leverage AI to analyze whether it's field notes or med info or congress activity to then help inform what your medical omnichannel strategy might look like, or that feedback loop that you were referring to earlier.
Exactly. All there. I mean, that's just it. I mean, personally, we're already all playing with things like Gen AI art, right? I've got some stupid pictures on my phone of where I've uploaded some photos and it's done me as a spaceman or something stupid. But that's the fun part. How do I apply that when I'm doing a medical Kaplan-Meier curve or a graph on antibiotic resistance? So there's definitely more to come here, but not just yet.
I agree. It's always easy to create fun little demos. Like, oh, generate this fun image, or, oh, cool, like generate this little graph. But I think when it comes down to, okay, we're writing very scientific, medical, factually accurate content, there's a lot more nuance involved. And we're still early in that process of figuring out where Gen AI fits in.
No, and I think the other part then to think about is when you think about medcom content, right, your publications and your medical content is often around new data, right? That's proprietary and it's not public. Right. So when you have that stuff, how would you generate that? We can't be throwing that into a Gen AI system where it can be pulled versus other stuff. There's security issues and, authenticity. There's definitely a lot to be thought through here. So then coming back to our principles discussions and the rest of this call, it's going to take time. It's going to take stakeholder discussions, looking at risk, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and then how do you roll that out across an enterprise in a consistent manner? It's going to take time.
And I would say, to add to that, very similar to your recommendation with medical omnichannel compliance, privacy, and regulatory is, pick 1 or 2 channels, do them really well. And kind of what I see with Gen AI just across the board, whether it's MedComs or other use cases, is, start with something that is fairly contained and perhaps low risk that can help everyone at the table from regulatory, legal, compliance, medical affairs, gather those data points around what the value is, what should the privacy compliance framework look like around these tools, how do we enable accuracy and consistency in kind of this contained environment. And then with all of those data points, there starts to be a bit more of a comfort level, right? Of, okay, we now have a little bit of an understanding. How do we now start building off top of this and expand our AI capabilities to other use cases? And maybe it's, I don't want to say like more risky use cases, but maybe more complex use cases that require a lot more thought into the process.
Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Paul. Really appreciate our conversation. I learned a lot through this as well, through your lens of what, I come from the more omni-channel side on the marketing commercial. So I have a very good understanding there. So I've learned a lot through our discussion and how to translate it. So thank you again for your time.
No, you're very welcome. It's a great discussion. It was always good to chat with you. So thank you for the opportunity.